Well, good evening, everyone. I'm Mark Nykirk, the director of the Scripps Howard Center for Civic Engagement at NKU, and welcome to 6 at 6. This is our fifth of six lectures this academic year, and so happy that you're able to be with us. We are virtual tonight. We have been kind of working our way back to some of the lectures being in person or hybrid, and but tonight we're virtual only. We will be in person and virtual, so hybrid for the next talk on April the 14th. So mark your calendars there. We'll be in the Digitorium in the College of Informatics at NKU. So come to campus to be with us live and in person if you would like to. We are focused this season of 6 at 6 on democracy, and have tried to break that down into a variety of topics. Last month, we had some photographers from the AP as we looked at the democracy and the press, and in April, we'll be looking at democracy and community voice. But tonight, we have Dr. Jocelyn Evans with us from the University of West Florida in Pensacola, and we are looking at how democracy interacts with our public spaces. I may get corrected by Jocelyn on this, but I'll just say that when I think about this, what comes to mind is the image of Lincoln in the White House receiving people from all over the country with their various complaints. I think that scene was recreated in Steven Spielberg's movie. But the notion that in a democracy, our buildings are our public spaces, and that we come to them and expect to be able to walk into City Hall and talk to the mayor, at one time to walk into the White House and talk to the president. We often speak of our buildings both nationally and in state and locally as the people's house. But things have changed in our lifetime, and a big change came after September the 11th. And Jocelyn's book, One Nation Under Siege, which is published by the University Press of Kentucky, a consortium press of which NKU is a member, came out in 2010 and examined what happened after 9/11, particularly as we saw a new Department of Homeland Security and appropriations for all of that, which if you read the book, you'll find chapters on how politics entered the distribution of that money. There's a shocker, isn't it, that there's money and politics are involved, but so there was that, and then January the 6th made us think about this again as we saw the protesters storm the Capitol, and Jocelyn is working on a follow-up manuscript right now to this book because the implications and the very different sorts of attacks on public buildings, and I'll let her talk about that. One important thing that I want to tell you is there is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Please put your questions there. We will monitor those and ask your questions. So just type your question in there and we'll pay attention to it. And let me introduce, bring Jocelyn Evans on screen. She is a professor of political science at University of West Florida in Pensacola, and at one time taught a lot of classes on American politics and Congress, but she's become something of an expert on this topic of public buildings, and more of her focus is on that. She's also teaches in her university's honors program. Jocelyn, welcome.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you for having me tonight. I do have a PowerPoint, so I'm going to take a second and try to share it real quickly. Let's see. Okay, can you see this? Can I have a confirmation one way or another?
Yes.
Great. Okay, wonderful. The technology worked. So as was mentioned, my background is in political science. I started out in a Department of Government, and my area of expertise was American politics with a focus on the Congress. So I want to tell you a little bit about what interests me about Congress and how exactly I ended up looking at the architecture of our civic spaces. So as part of my PhD program, I served as an APSA Congressional Fellow. That's the American Political Science Association has a congressional fellowship where PhDs and other practitioners spend a year on the Hill working for a member of Congress or a committee or a party office so that they share their expertise, but they also get an inside look at how Congress works and can, work on PR for Congress. So it's a mutually beneficial program. The year that I went to serve as an APSA fellow was in the fall of 2000 and the spring and summer of 2001. So I happened to be there for the Bush-Gore election. I was there when the Supreme Court handed down their decision in that election. And I was there for 9/11 and then for anthrax. And a lot of times we talk a lot about 9/11, but we don't really pay attention to the disruption that was caused by anthrax and the subsequent changes to the Hill and its processes that ensued. So my own personal story of being a staffer in a leadership office on the Hill at those critical moments, that really is important to understanding why I study and think about the things that I do. So 9/11. So I had been working again since the fall, and I want to tell you a little bit about my 9/11 story because it's relevant. I was on the Hill. I was working in the Longworth building for a House Party leadership office. So I had a very firsthand picture or window on how security was organized and what happened, when 9/11 all of a sudden not only threatens the World Trade Center, but also threatens the Pentagon. And we hear that there is a plane that's unaccounted for, and it may have as a target the Capitol building itself, in which members were in session on that day. I got to see what the response was to that threat in real time. There was no coordinated, centralized security plan. Capitol Police were looking to the Speaker's office, the Senate office. They were looking for direction, and the leadership offices were looking to the Capitol Police for direction. There was not clear centralized leadership or coordinated plan. So our chief of staff literally told us, you all need to evacuate, keep your phones on. And with that, we left from the Longworth office building and we made our way down to the C Street Metro. So this is off of C Street, right outside of the Cannon House office building. And you can see the smoke on the horizon, and that is actually smoke from the Pentagon. So as I got into my car, I said, oh my word, I have to take a picture of this. So the pictures appear in the book. I can't find the originals anymore, so I had to screenshot it. But this was my view as we began to evacuate that leadership office on that day. And then we were some of the first to evacuate, and so we made it across the interstate. This was the view that we saw from my vehicle of the Pentagon from I-395. We ended up, it took quite a while for us to get to the apartment because of all the emergency vehicles on the roads. And we watched the Pentagon on fire for several days as they tried to put out the flames. And so the weird thing about 9/11 was we were evacuated, and then they assessed this was a security threat, all's clear, and we were back at work the next day. And it was such a jarring experience for the entire country that our bosses literally told us, don't place any calls. don't respond to email, don't plan anything, because we're in a period of mourning and DC operates at a quicker pace than everywhere else. And we just need to give people a moment. So I remember having to literally sit on my hands and not do because of the tragedy. It wasn't because I wasn't at the office. I was back at the office. Everything was as it had been. My mother recently asked me how I was feeling about Russia and Ukraine, and whether I felt like, the problems of this world are just too great. And I had to reflect to her that my moment, when the world felt really too difficult, was on 9/11. When I saw this scene, it was unlike anything I had ever experienced on American soil. And this was the closest I had come to acts of violence, acts of terror. And so I told her that I can only imagine from this experience, this brush, what the citizens of Ukraine must be experiencing right now. So that, I've been thinking about that today as I prepared my remarks. This was a surreal moment in American history. We did end up going right back to the office, and in the days that followed, all of a sudden, there was a run on flags. You couldn't find flags through Walmart, through Amazon. They just weren't available because people were buying them up and then were displaying them prominently in a show of patriotism for this nation. That also happened in DC. So these were different offices across the Hill. Every office had a flag and they were displaying it outside their windows. These were present at the RNC and the DNC headquarters as well. I'll never forget that period where we saw this bipartisan show of patriotism. After that, I decided that I would try to capture this moment by interviewing members of Congress from various committees about their feelings about security and the changes that they saw beginning to emerge on the Hill to ensure the safety of our Capitol complex. So these are just some of the thoughts that I captured during that interview data collection process. It's been an evolutionary process. When I came, there was no magnetometer, no barriers. You go in and out of the Capitol. It's changed considerably. Another member said, there's a lasting effect you can see everywhere. There's a type of armament, the vests they're wearing, the roads that are blocked, the gas masks. This is going to be around. Used to be, you didn't want to get into Big Brother watching you. It was amazing that there was no security. There weren't any barricades. And then a final comment, the House floor looks a lot like it did in 1954. That's an important year because that's the year that Puerto Rican nationalists actually fired on the floor from the House gallery. So, it's relatively the same, but you can still see the bullet holes. There are cubbies underneath the chairs now that include gas masks. So, early on, there were some things that encroached that we could see, oh, this is going to be a lasting security marker. So I experienced 9/11 in 2001. And then a month later, we had anthrax hit the Hill. And that was more of a displacement event. Once they found that in office buildings across the Hill, we were evacuated and only critical personnel were allowed back on the Hill. And so my husband now, he was the legislative correspondent for our member, which meant he dealt with all the mail. And they paused the mail and they redirected it to the district so that it could go through intense bleaching and screening and then not be brought into our office buildings. And so we were not critical personnel and we were at home for a number of weeks. And ultimately we decided to move back to the home district because we could better do our jobs. So there was a real impact of anthrax to both of our careers, in fact. But that experience then led to me doing all of this investigative work, several elite interviews on both the House and Senate side of members of Capitol Police, of historians. And this ultimately was the book that came from that effort. And there really isn't anything else like it out there. just because it's quite niche. It was, we thought, a one-time event, and I just felt like I was capturing history. And then January 6th happened, and I found myself right back at the table thinking about securitization and the future of American democracy. So right now I am thinking about how do I update this project to include January 6th, and how do I bring meaning to that event and to the future of our civic spaces. So the most important thing that I hope that people would take away from this book on 9/11 and anthrax is that it wasn't really as unique as we might think. The Capitol has been the focal point, the focus of attacks for our entire history, for 220 years. It starts with the burning of the Capitol by the British in the War of 1812. There have been fires, assassination attempts. We've had individual members of Congress that were targeted, for example. We've had, I mentioned the Puerto Rican nationalists. That was a very prominent event in the history of attacks on the Hill. But there were also bomb threats by the Weather Underground. There were 2 Capitol police officers who were shot back in the late 1990s. So all of this sets the stage for what happened on 9/11 and anthrax, and then January 6th. And not only are these security threats not unique, but security responses are also not unique. So in the aftermath of each of these individual crises, we saw commensurate measures being taken by congressional leadership to increase our preparedness. So I'm going to show you some images of January 6th and the security that happened around it. But a lot of our security protocol was put in place in the 1970s and 80s. It included X-ray machines, magnetometers, cameras, increasing our Capitol Police force, mail being sent through, and different screenings. So this is a history, and our response to the most recent set of threats speaks to that history. It only adds to that history. So with all of these threats, bomb threats and gunmen and fires, and we still continue to use this building. We haven't moved away from it. And there's a reason for it. The United States Capitol really does represent, not only here, but around the world, the values of freedom and democracy. It is renowned for its statement of neoclassicism. It's one of the most recognized symbols around the world, the free world of democracy in action. It was planned, right? This is part of L'Enfant's majestic vision for the District of Columbia. It was put on the prominent hill because it was supposed to be the first branch of government. So for us as students of American history, it's a very important space. We consider it to be hallowed ground. It is sacred secular space. Let's see, what did I do? There we go. So with that as kind of the background, I hope that it's more apparent why I'm particularly interested in a democratic conflict and the implications that conflict has for securing public space. I not only research the Capitol, but my work has moved into looking at judicial spaces. I have a brand new book on the Supreme Court as a democratic space. Also, I'm interested in town halls or assembly buildings, city council chambers. I'm interested in all the places where democratic conflict manifests in the built environment. So what I hope to do is reserve time for questions, but I'm going to quickly move through what we mean when we talk about social meaning of democratic space or architecture. I'm going to explore some patterns that we see at the Capitol that reveal distinct classes of space. And then I'm going to talk about the Capitol as type, as an architectural type. And that will then lay the foundation to look at January 6th and the immediate hardening on our nation's capital and what it means for us in terms of affect or how we feel about our legislative assembly hall. Okay, so when we talk about patterns in the built environment and the specific patterns of civic space, there's one typology presented by Charles Goodsell that's particularly helpful. I find it to be helpful. He classifies 6 different distinct types of space. So your sanctums, that's elite space. So that would be where your member of Congress works at the desk. So on January 6th, we saw people go into Nancy Pelosi's office and put their feet on her desk. That would be intrusion into a sanctum space. Operational space are staff spaces. So that would be the broader office building or office member's office where their staff works. That space exists to support the work of the elites. Audience spaces is where they host visitors, small groups. So oftentimes I found on the Hill, they're likely to host small audiences in their office. They have their desk and then they have a couch, a love seat, a coffee table, and that's where they host visitors. Civic space is what we mean when we talk about, the image in our head, the House floor or the Senate floor. This would also be a courtroom in your local county courthouse. Circulation spaces are where we all walk around, how we circulate through the building. And so in Capitol buildings, oftentimes you'll see rotundas, and that provides an easy circulation space for press as well as for the general audience. And then finally, perimeter space is separate from circulation space. It's the outside of the building. So it is where the public moves, but it's the exterior as opposed to the interior. So when we look at the Capitol as type, there's several features that I want to make sure that you notice. Well, let me go back one step. Things that I notice when I look at this is its neoclassical design, which speaks of a kind of temple motif. It's that sacred secular space. It means to us a reverence for the rule of law, for civil society, for Republican democracy. It is a testament to the values of the Enlightenment. Separate from that, we see a dome. And on the outside, it's a dome, and on the inside, it's a rotunda. That actually has meaning. The dome is the cap or the head or the crown of our government. And so it stands as representative of popular sovereignty, but also it sits in the middle of the House and the Senate. So it also represents the juncture of a system of separated powers. The rotunda on the inside not only facilitates ease of access and movement, but it suggests a unity of purpose. We're in this together. And so in our rotunda, there's major pieces of art that tell the American story, which is important because it's a space of unifying rather than dividing. This pattern is repeated. It's repeated all over the place. So I did my doctoral work at the University of Oklahoma. My colleague on this project is a faculty member at the University of Oklahoma. And so we use the Oklahoma Capitol just to illustrate the same pattern. So you see temple motif, central dome, park-like grounds. You'll notice that our capitals have these big open vistas. Olmsted was responsible for the landscape architecture of the US Capitol. And there's an emphasis on maintaining the openness of the grounds. And this is important because it is a symbolic device. It tells us that government is open to us, that its actions are transparent, that we are able to approach it and provide oversight. So open grounds is another one of those symbols that is really important for us to pay attention to. On the inside, you see rotunda, and this is very similar to our US rotunda. And oftentimes it lets us see up all of the floors, and there's a beautiful, beautiful top to the rotunda that we want to take pictures of. We have looked, and this pattern does repeat 38 times. So out of our 50 state capitals, 80% of them follow this type in some way, shape, or form. You'll see a temple, a dome, open vistas, park-like grounds. This pattern repeats. So it has meaning. So that's how a political scientist who thinks about the social meaning of civic space might look at the capital and state capitals. But we're talking about the built environment, and we are not the first, we're not the most important to think about the built environment. There are whole fields, right? I mentioned landscape architecture, there's urban design, there's the field of architecture. How do they look at space, right? They think about physical qualities. They talk about space in terms of its function or its purpose. They look at spaces as they are adjacent to each other. They think about vertical as well as horizontal positioning. So what are the vertical relationships that are being articulated here? They think about the behavior of those who use the space. So utilization, how do people engage with this built environment, and is it effective in facilitating that behavior? And then they do also think in terms of values and meaning, but they're more interested in what's implied by the form, the shape, the materials, and then overall, what's the aesthetic quality? So one of the ways in which we kind of systematically go about evaluating spaces is to map these things. Let's look solely at the visual prominence and think in terms of physical quality, function or purpose, adjacent. So you can see this is what I would do to map out what is this space saying? What is it doing? How is it impacting its use? But there aren't only architects who think about space. Urban planners think about space. And an urban planner will not only want to take into consideration the US Capitol, he or she will also want to think in terms of the broader system. How does this building articulate with its surroundings? And if you've worked on the Hill, or if you've read a lot of inside baseball news on the Hill, they tend to talk about it as the US Capitol complex or the campus, the Hill complex, the Capitol campus. And they think of it not only in terms of its interior spaces, they think about it in terms of its articulation with its neighboring spaces. So the tunnels, for example, can get you to the Library of Congress. The architect also works with the US Supreme Court. Anyone who's in charge of security is thinking about who's going to be using Union Station and what would be the traffic flow to the Capitol building itself. It articulates with the mall on the other side. And in fact, Pennsylvania Avenue takes you directly down to the White House. So an urban planner would be thinking about all of these adjacent spaces and how they speak to each other and what is the pattern that's created. If we zoom out even further, we begin to see another important quality of capital cities. Vail talks about power and authority in capital cities, not capital buildings, but capital cities. And he pays attention to, transportation streams, flows. Was this capital, is it an evolved capital? Has it emerged over several centuries? Or was it built to be a capital by design? So the US Capitol, Washington, D.C., was built by design. L'Enfant laid it out, and it has these grand bifurcating vistas. And each is kind of, highlighted with a central feature. Our metro system is designed around these major corridors of governmental power. If you go to Arlington and Arlington National Cemetery and you go to Lee's home, you can see where L'Enfant is buried and you can take in the full view of the city. So it was a planned city, and that's important. It adds to the meaning. The Capitol isn't just plopped on top of something else, but rather it was meant to be there very purposefully. Not only has the city evolved, but the building itself has evolved. And so if we go back to the original designs for the building and then construction, so the Senate wing was built first, and then they were building the House wing and the Senate wing was burned by the British. And then they got both built back and they began to work on the dome. But what it looked like in 1830 was very different than what it looked like at the end of the Civil War when we were just finishing the dome. You see extensions on the west side, which facilitates inauguration events, and you see extensions on the east side, which is often the site of public protest. And then lastly, I'm going to pay attention to the Capitol Visitor Center, which opened in 2008. So as you can see, we built out, we built up, and most recently we have actually built down. So I want to focus on the last 40 years of Capitol history as a precursor for understanding the securitization regime that we have currently. So if you came to visit the Hill prior to 9/11, I'm going to take a drink. If you came to visit before 9/11, you would enter the Capitol from the front steps. There were several points of entry. This is mostly on the east side. You could go up the middle, you could go up the sides, you could come into the Senate chamber actually through another entry. And if you look at the flow through the building, because there are these major halls in the Great Rotunda, you didn't have to really go through many rooms in order to actually get to the chamber. You would have to go upstairs to view from the gallery, but it's not that deep. Like our major civic spaces are not that deep inside the building. It's a very shallow access. And in fact, because you could enter from the front steps, you could also park right outside the building. This is an image from a few decades ago. And here's another image. You know, one looks to be about from the 1950s and the other from about the 1970s, 1980s. The lawn of the Capitol actually was a parking lot. People would park there and then they would walk up the steps to go watch Congress in session. In fact, in the book, I have one image of me as a little girl. That's my mother. She was pregnant with my brother. This is the early 1980s, and they took me on a trip to DC. I don't remember it, but I do have this picture, and it stands as a testament to a bygone era. So before 9/11, it really was the schoolhouse rock. I'm just a bill on Capitol Hill. Anybody can, come to see their member of Congress, come up the steps to the Capitol and watch government in action. I want to make the case that that is not what it is today. It's not exactly the same. A lot has changed. And I want to look at what exactly has changed, when it's changed, and why it matters. So post 9/11, there were some immediate changes that were made. If you had visited before 9/11 and then visited in 2003, 2004, you immediately would recognize that things were different. So you had permanent police, you had perimeter alarms, security cameras, you had hydraulic barricades that were deployed as needed. They would come up or go down. The office buildings surrounding were closed. The streets were closed, excuse me. There were additional vehicle barriers, big bollards that were installed specifically to protect against truck bombs. That was in the aftermath of the Oklahoma City bombing. Garage access was heavily curtailed for members and their staff even. We saw things about how we could deploy the National Guard, which becomes relevant to the January 6th story. And very importantly, we finally bit the bullet and appropriated the funds to build the Capitol Visitor Center, which was a huge project that took several years. Because of the threat that anthrax posed, we also put in place protection against biochemical warfare. So there were go packs that were deployed to all of the members' offices, and these included gas masks and escape hoods. Screening was beefed up, and we really increased the number of Capitol Police we had, as well as their training. So you can see, if you follow the money Mark mentioned, you can see how our appropriations bills, one after the other, successfully increased funding and increased our preparedness. But I want to focus on, the built environment and what exactly changed to the physical complex. The biggest change really was the Capitol Visitor Center. And if you haven't visited Congress since 9/11, you wouldn't even know it exists. Really, you have to experience the space to really recognize the change. So in order to enter Congress now, you approach it from the road. So the road that flows between the Capitol and the Supreme Court. and the old Library of Congress. You would enter from that road and you would walk down. You see these rows of trees and they slope downward. You would slope generally down this gradual walk, and then you would enter into these, they almost look like bunkers, if you will, and just past them, it looks like fountains or some kind of, flat space. Those are actually skylights that I'm going to show you a picture of in just a second. So you would enter through that kind of bunker opening. And in fact, I thought that the architecture looked very similar to the Holocaust Museum. And I think it was the same designer. So it's this very kind of, stripped, almost brutalist entryway. So you take that in. Here is kind of a more straight on view. So they've cleared anything else that was atop that space. They have protected the Olmsted scenery to the side, but it creates this huge plaza and is solely intended to help facilitate entry of visitors from a distance away from the building. So once you're inside the Capitol Visitor Center, those what appear to be kind of like fountains, actually you see that they are skylights, and this is the view that you have of the Capitol. So I was into this project because of my experience on 9/11 and through anthrax, but it was really when I experienced this space that I started to fully focus on the built environment, not just changes in culture, but actual change in the physical surrounding. I was really struck by this visual. I had never really heard of the notion of social meaning of civic space. I didn't know that was a thing, but my gut told me that this just didn't feel right. That's the best way that I can put it. I just bristled at seeing the rotunda, seeing the dome from below in a democracy, in a Republican democracy, and in this iconic space. And so it really shaped the trajectory of my research agenda. This singular image really put me moving in a different path. If you're inside the visitor center, here is what, the first level. So you enter, you go through security screening, you check your coat if you need to, and then you actually go down further to go to the main hall, Emancipation Hall. You'll see that the statue in the hall is a replica of what's on top of the dome. And then if you want to do the galleries, then you actually have to go through a second screening in the back of the facility. This is the lower level, and it includes orientation theaters. It also has food. And so pay attention to that, because we're going to talk next about what you cannot bring into the space. But something that has changed definitely is that now all Capitol tours are run through the CVC. So if you want a tour, you don't go to your member's office. You go there if you need gallery passes. But if you want a tour, you go to the CVC, you have a timed tour. All of the tour guides are trained to give the exact same spiel, and they're all wearing red coats. So you get your tour by CVC staff who are ironically in red coats. And it's very much a standardized experience. That's why when they said on January 6th that they thought that certain members had been doing tours for constituents a few days before, that was significant because that would have been outside of the CVC. It's also significant because the CVC is still not doing tours. Since COVID, they have not re-engaged the public through public tours. Okay, so there are several restrictions when you go to visit the CVC. You can't bring any liquids, food, beverage, sprays. You can't bring any pointed objects. I'm a crocheter and a knitter, so I noticed this. You can't have any big bags. You, of course, can't have any guns or knives. You can't have pepper spray, and you can't have razors. But I just want you to stop and think about, to what extent does this absolutely just reflect airport security? And to what extent does this actually involve even higher security standards than what we see and what we've grown to anticipate in going through airport security? And then I want you to ask yourself, if you're a tourist and you've packed for the day, you're going to go to many sites, what in your bag would you have to throw away or get rid of in order to go in and actually see the Capitol building? Not inside Congress, just inside the Capitol Visitor Center. Because what we find is that's to get into this space. This is the open Emancipation Hall on the bottom. They've also moved several of the statues from Statuary Hall now take up residence in the CBC Emancipation Hall. But that would be to get into this space. If you want to go into see the gallery, there's additional restrictions. So you can't bring any kind of electronic device that's battery operated. You can't have cameras. You can't have any video recorders or any type of recording device. So this means that you can't have any phones, because all of our phones now are also recorders. You can't have cans, bottles, creams, lotions. You can't have any packages. So you can't take your briefcase and your phone and go sit in the gallery and observe Congress in action. All of that would have to be checked at a separate coat check. So I include this because not only is it an added restriction, but I also have a personal story that I experienced the last time I was there. So I was with some students, I think, and I wanted to take them to go watch Congress in action. And we were on the Senate side. This was before January 6th. And I remember getting all the way up to the gallery and then having to check all of my additional stuff. And we were slowed down. We were having to wait quite a bit, and I couldn't understand why. And then I realized that there was a World War II vet in a wheelchair in front of us, and they were trying to get him to go through the metal detector before they would let him into the gallery. And he was elderly, and it was involved, and it was not happening. And it just really, again, it was one of those moments that it was not right. And I knew that something had changed. So my co-author developed these little cartoons, but I think that this kind of captures, what has changed. And it gets to the point of our work, which is, if we say that things carry social meaning, how do we know? And one of the things that a lot of architectural scholarship today is looking into is the idea of affect, or the push or pull of a space on our emotions. So how does a space make us feel? How is it pushing us to feel? So what are the things you're being asked to do? Raise your hands, empty your pockets, show your papers, state your business, prove that you're innocent to us before we'll let you into this space. And so, how does that make you feel? That does not make you feel free. It makes you feel the opposite of free. It makes you feel guilty, negative, fearful, anxious, like you're an intruder. And so all of this adds up to the post 9/11 environment. This is just, I took a screenshot. I checked just today, and the Capitol Visitor Center still remains closed. So there are no tours of Congress, and there haven't been in 2 years. And so when we see this staff aren't even working on the Hill. This was the first time, not only that people had taken over the complex like this, but also that people had been that close to Congress in years, literally in years, that people have been inside the Capitol building in years. So what do we make of this visual? What rhetorical things are going on here? The people involved made a claim to this space. They said, this is our house. This is our government, our Congress. Let us in. There were also efforts to degrade the space. So, they were trashing spaces. They were breaking windows. And, there was also a commensurate kind of surrender of the space. The security force that was in place was not adequate to meet the challenge. And it took some time to actually bring reinforcements. And so that speaks to, why wasn't there adequate security? Why didn't we see this coming? And we know that depending on what party lens you bring to this event, there's a very different conception of what was going on here. For some, this was revolution. This was actually taking to the streets. This was challenging what some perceived as election fraud. For others, this was an assassination attempt. This was hijacking government and desecrating sacred space. So there are definite party differences in the symbolism and the social meaning of these civic spaces. But this is where we are. This is what we have to grapple with in the aftermath. We know that there was an August 9th GAO report that requested 80 additional Capitol Police. 60 officers were assaulted on that day, and all told about $1.5 million in damages is what they estimate was done. And we know that there were 7, associated deaths. And we have currently ongoing a special committee investigation into the events of that day. I want to take us back really quickly before I kind of wrap up in time for question to the path that they took when they came into the building. So they flowed in from these 3 entry points, and they were on the bottom level. And so we saw them in the crypt. And it was on both sides. It was both on the east front and on the west front. Oops, wrong way. And then they climbed up the stairs, and there's some famous footage of Capitol Police redirecting away from the Senate chamber. That was kind of the first space to be threatened, but then we also saw the first real break-in happen into the speaker's lobby, and that's where the fatal shooting happened. And there were efforts to get on both the Senate chamber floor and the House chamber floor, and those were successful efforts. We had members who were actually seeking cover up in the gallery spaces. So I mention this because we just saw in action how shallow accessibility is into these national civic spaces. And it takes us right back to this pre 9/11 flow. So this was not unusual flow. This was actually traditional flow in these spaces. It was just unsolicited, uninvited. And it then was accompanied by, National Guard eventually showing up and having a very strong presence late into the evening. There were curfews that were put into place, and people started writing, pieces for newspapers calling it a fortress. We saw the following few days gearing up for the inauguration. Many National Guard were deployed to the US Capitol, and they were actually sleeping on the Capitol floor. We saw it leading up to the inauguration. Not only was the Capitol building and the White House, kind of locked down, but the entire perimeter in a urban planning, urban design, broader city kind of orientation as a system, it was shut down. And the fences stayed. As late as September, barbed wire fences were around our Capitol building in case a similar kind of protest happened. So to draw to a close, what did we see come out of that? What have been the recommendations in light of January 6th? So there was that massive fencing. They wanted to modernize our camera systems, increase obstacles so that it wasn't so easy to flow directly to the floor or these high sanctum spaces. There's been a call for ways to selectively compartmentalize the Capitol building so you could shut off certain parts and keep others open. More trainings, more background checks, more card readers, more screening portals. None of this is new, but there's even more push to create stronger glass. After 9/11, we had bomb, safe glass, but now we're calling for even increased impenetrable glass as well. Following, I just want to bring up two quotes. Following 9/11, you had a Democratic member who reflected to me, there are greater security barriers, multiple layers. It feels like being in the former Soviet Union because of all the armed guards. Turkey is like a fortress. Government of Hong Kong sits up with mansions. The US Embassy was built underground in Beirut. But here, if we have to live underground, we will not prevail. And I thought that was really poignant. In response to January 6th, we've seen an effort through a select committee to not to investigate January 6th, but rather to think about how we can modernize the facilities of the Capitol. especially given COVID and, high flex work environments. And they just recently had a hearing just a few days ago, and I would encourage everyone to go listen to it. Representative Phillips, who sits on the committee, said these words, and it was like catnip to me. He said, "Space, when employed well, when thoughtfully designed, can force collaboration, innovation, and better outcomes. Conversely, when poorly designed, poorly utilized, it impedes better outcomes. I see a grand opportunity to preserve and protect these extraordinary facilities, but also bring them to the 21st century so that those who serve as members of Congress will be forced by design to work more closely together. That's our inspiration, and that's our aspiration." And the committee actually has chosen a space where they can work around a huge round table, because being at a dais and facing outward towards the witnesses, they find is not really conducive to bipartisan work. And they're finding it to be a very effective design solution for them to work around a table. And so they're asking questions of the architect. Can we do more of this? How can we encourage through design better democracy? So I'd like to end there and open it up to questions. I think that's a good place to stop. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Well, first of all, Jocelyn, thank you. Zoom webinars don't allow audiences to applaud all that so well, but please accept our applause. So I encourage the audience, if you have a question, to put it in the Q&A. The first question we have is actually just a compliment for the presentation and the body of work. So thank you for that. I'm wondering, and I think that I'm correct, that you work with a partner whose expertise is in architecture. Are you consulted from time to time on how to do public buildings? Suppose a city is trying to construct a new city hall. What advice would you give them, both from a security standpoint and vis-a-vis that last quote that you put up on a space that encourages collaboration and interaction?
So this is a great question, and it takes me right back to my APSA fellowship, because my collaborator has a graduate student who just had the opportunity to work on the Hill as an APSA fellow. And he chose to work with the Select Committee on Modernization of Congress for his fellowship. So he reached out to us and said, "Hey, I need to prep these members to have this hearing, to invite witnesses. What should we be reading?" And so we were able to summarize this literature, some of which I presented tonight, to actually kind of set the table, set the stage for this discussion between the architect of the Capitol and members of Congress, which is just cool. That's just cool to be able to say that, that you get to be involved at that level in some small way. But I would say that there are definite takeaways. First, I'll start with horizontal and vertical relationships. So we know that when things are elevated, they give off the impression of more powerful, more authority. So we tend to build things on a hill if we want them to be seen as important. If we are building a governmental space like a city hall, county commission chamber, a courtroom, oftentimes we'll raise the judge's bench so that the judge is seen as the most important person, the person with the power in this space. There's other trappings like robes, for example, but in terms of like the physical layout of the room and the furniture in the space, these things matter. So I would encourage people to think about what they're saying in terms of power dynamic when they introduce furniture into space or elevate certain places. We're doing a lot of work on Georgia county courthouses, and specifically those that were constructed during the Jim Crow era. And we're thinking about how galleries were used to actually ensure segregation. So we might think of galleries as only from the vantage point of, oh, wow, I can go and observe government in action. I can see everything. There's not a glass barrier in front of me like there is in some Capitol buildings. But in a different era, that was actually a racialized space. And so thinking about what's the history of the space, the context, as well as the design, gives us a better understanding of what social meaning it carries.
Following up a little bit in terms of how, let's say, a public meeting room is laid out over the past year or so, we've seen a lot of particularly school board meetings where people are shouting and at the school officials who are typically elevated, and the person speaking is from a mic. But are there design configurations that that deal with that interaction from the public? In Kentucky, there has been some discussion of legislation to mandate a public commentary period at school board meetings, and some I've heard the counter argument that the school board meeting is actually a meeting, an operational meeting, and not really a public meeting, which sounds a little arrogant, but on the other hand, Congress legislates without the public having a moment, can't walk onto the floor and comment. But somehow at our local level, we still want to have the ability to walk into a school board meeting or a city council meeting and speak our piece. So are there ways to, what advice would you give about how to configure such space?
So I'm going to answer that in two parts. The first is because of my interest in the built environment, when I saw members of Congress advertising tele-town halls instead of physical town halls, because town hall meetings have become so toxic and combative, I was immediately interested in that. And so I do have a book on congressional communication in a digital age that takes up this question squarely. Why has it been more difficult to go to a town hall, go to a school board meeting, talk to your elected representatives? How do we anticipate member behavior? Like, when are members going to make themselves available and when are they not going to make themselves available? What kind of venue are they going to choose to have that engagement? And that squarely relates to control. They're going to choose a space they have control over. And so the tele-town hall is like a conference call. You basically sign up and you say, yeah, I want to be invited to that. And then at a certain time, you call in and you get to hear the member talk and then facilitate Q&A, but all of the Q&A is moderated in the same way that you're moderating Q&A here, right? So you get to listen to the staff select whatever questions they're going to ask of the member and the member answer. There is no way that you can be disruptive in this space, and you have no sense of who is there with you. So you don't know if it's your neighbor. You don't know if there's 1,000 people or there's only 10 people. You have no way of knowing that information. And so members really like this vehicle because you can have thousands of constituents spread all over the district on the same call. You also can selectively invite. So only people who are signed up to get your newsletter know about your town hall, and those tend to be similarly partisan, co-partisans. So that's one way that we've seen that public discourse stripped from any physical space or centralized social space. It's in private homes, but it's very decentralized and controllable. So that's one thing that I would say. But separately, you asked, how do you structure a space? And, I would say, think about when you feel like you can approach the person who is the speaker or who is your representative. They typically get out from behind the lectern. They come down to the same level you are. They have a mic that they walk around with, not a big, up at the dais. And they take their jacket off and they roll their sleeves up, and they shake your hand as an individual and they talk to you about how you're doing. And so anything that takes down the barriers, the physical barriers or the informal cues that we give off that are barriers to communication, I think is a step in the right direction.
Remind the audience, if you have a question, put it in the Q&A. I'm wondering, while we think about this in the United States, we're not the only democracy in the world. And after all, the Greeks and Romans before us had public squares. What are we dealing with it any differently than history did, or our contemporary democracies elsewhere in the world?
So two answers that immediately come to mind. One is, we are a two-party system, and a lot of advanced democracies elsewhere have multi-party systems. And the floor plan of their assembly hall actually facilitates that multi-party dynamic because they don't have one central aisle that divides the right from the left. Rather, they have, multiple aisles and these little pie wedges. And it facilitates, they're typically laid out in terms of ideological spectrum. So it will go right to left, but there is less of a physical barrier to building the grand coalition, if you will. So that's an example of an interior design element that could be, that we could draw from. Separately, I think about the German Bundestag, and their dome is actually glass. And so it still has the same symbolism of a dome. This is the crown of power, the people's house, but it also gives off, it symbolizes transparency, government in action. I think the Welsh Parliament, the gallery, it kind of is the inverted model of that. The gallery is this glass all the way around the assembly chamber. So you can look down and observe. And so the PA system, I think you can hear what they're talking about. It's not open air, but it is this glass where you're actually above them in their business. So there are lots of different ways, creative ways, that nations have thought about the social meaning of their civic spaces to facilitate strong democratic behavior.
Well, thank you. And we have answered, I think, the questions from the audience. I'm just going to remind everybody, One Nation Under Siege, available online from the University Press of Kentucky or from your local bookstore. So, and Dr. Evans, thank you very much for really bringing a topic that I hadn't thought about much until I took a look at the book. And so thank you for the research and for tonight's comments, and stay safe in Pensacola. Those of us not in Western Florida right now may not realize that the weather is a little threatening. So we need safety in buildings in other ways too, right? So
Thank
good
you
night.
so much for having me.
Oh, well, you're most welcome. And everybody mark your calendars for April the 14th. Chris Wilkie, who teaches in the English department at NKU and has been working for a number of years on with residents of over the Rhine, so that voices of people that we sometimes look past are voices that we don't look past. So Dr. Wilkie will talk to us about his work and what works in that as we continue to look at the importance of democracy from various aspects. And our April 14th lecture will be co-sponsored by Kentucky Humanities, who has, like us, also focused this year on their theme is democracy and the informed citizen. So we appreciate the collaboration with Kentucky Humanities, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary. So thanks everyone, and good night. And we will see you on April the 14th.